The wind sliced through the early evening like a knife, turning the streets of New York into a blur of white and shadow. Snow drifted down in heavy flakes, covering the city in a hushed silence that muffled even the distant sirens and honking taxis. Under a flickering street lamp at the edge of 56th and Madison, a lone figure stood hunched against the cold. Wes Carter pulled his frayed green coat tighter around his chest, the manila folder clutched against him as if it could protect him from more than just the snow. Inside were 5 copies of his resume, 5 dreams, 5 rejections. At 47, Wes had once been a structural engineer, a builder of homes and schools. But now, he was simply displaced, a widower, a father, and tonight, a man without a home. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the freezing air, and glanced up at the blurry red glow of a nearby pharmacy sign. 8:41 p.m. The bus was late. Not that he had anywhere important to be. His boots were soaked through to the socks. He flexed his toes, trying to keep them warm. Then, from across the snow-covered sidewalk, the sharp click of heels rang out. Wes looked up. A woman was approaching, maybe mid-30s, no coat, just a business skirt, a thin blouse, and those heels that didn't belong on a night like this. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks. She crossed her arms and stepped beneath the awning beside him, visibly trembling, her hands rubbed together in a losing battle against the cold. Wes looked away. This was New York. You didn't stare. You minded your business, especially when you had nothing to offer. Just another cold night, just another stranger. But then the wind picked up, sharp and brutal. She flinched, teeth chattering, arms folding tighter. Wes turned to glance at her again. She looked like she'd come from another world, clean, crisp, corporate, but now she was just another person shivering in the snow. He hesitated. His coat wasn't much, it barely kept him warm. But it was something. He could keep it, pretend not to see her discomfort. Or he could do something. Without a word, he unzipped the jacket and shrugged it off. Instantly, the cold bit through his sweater, stinging his skin. He stepped forward and offered the coat. She looked at him, startled. You don't have to do that. He gave a tired smile. I know, but I've already lost enough today. This coat, it's just about the only thing I have left to give. Her brow creased. But you need it more than I do. Still, he gently draped it around her shoulders. Not tonight, he said quietly. The warmth startled her. It smelled faintly of soap and coffee. Familiar. Safe. She pulled it tighter without realizing. Thank you, she whispered. He just nodded, wrapping his arms around himself for warmth. They stood in silence, the snow falling around them like feathers. After a long pause, she turned toward him. What's your name? Wes. I'm Elena. Nice to meet you. Elena, you shouldn't have given me your coat. Probably not, he chuckled, but I couldn't just stand there and let you freeze. The low rumble of an engine interrupted the quiet. A bus appeared through the snow, headlights glowing soft through the flurry. Elena stepped forward, then paused. Do you have somewhere to go? Wes shrugged. Yeah, somewhere. He didn't elaborate. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small card. If you ever need anything. Wes took it without looking and slipped it into his folder. People always said things like that. Most didn't mean it. Elena climbed onto the bus, pausing at the door to glance back. The coat wrapped tightly around her like armor. Wes watched as the bus rolled away and disappeared into the snow. The cold stung harder now, but he wasn't shivering from the temperature anymore. It was something else. He looked up at the sky and then down the empty street. Maybe tomorrow, he whispered, and with that, he turned and walked into the dark. The streets grew quieter the further Wes walked. A few blocks down, the neon lights gave way to the dim glow of warehouses and chain-link fences. Snow crunched under his worn shoes. By the time he reached the edge of the Bronx, the only sound was the wind. There, tucked behind an abandoned loading dock, sat an old pickup truck. A 99 Dodge Ram with rust curling along its frame like ivy. The back window was patched with duct tape, and the tires were half buried in slush. Wes climbed in, careful not to let too much snow fall into the blankets on the passenger seat. Inside, the air was stale but dry. He pulled the door shut and leaned back. The engine hadn't worked in months. His breath fogged up the glass. From the glove compartment, he pulled out a small metal tin. Inside, carefully folded, was a photograph, his wife, Grace, smiling wide in a summer dress, and their son, Ben, around 8 years old, grinning crookedly with 2 front teeth missing. "Good night, Grace," Wes whispered, touching her face with a finger. "Good night, Benny." He sat in silence for a moment before unfolding his son's drawing, a crayon masterpiece of 2 stick figures beneath a crooked sun. With the words, "I love you, Dad, Ben." He hadn't seen Ben in almost a year. After Grace passed, things spiraled fast, bills swallowed his savings, and the mortgage went unpaid. Wes had walked away from his job to care for her full-time, thinking he could return once things settled. But life had other plans. Eventually, child services stepped in, said a truck wasn't a home, said Ben needed structure, warmth, safety. Wes had understood. He hadn't fought, just hugged his son tight and promised, "This is only temporary." He sent job applications every week, stood in line for job fairs, showed up to interviews in hand-washed shirts and polished boots, even when his soles were cracked. Some nights, when the wind blew wrong, he thought of giving up. But then he'd see Ben's drawing and remember, promises still mattered. Tonight, that promise felt heavy in his chest. He thought of Elena, how surprised she'd looked, how grateful. Maybe that was why he gave her the coat. To remember he still could do something decent. That he wasn't completely invisible. Wes leaned back, tugged the threadbare blanket up to his chin, and shut his eyes. For now, he still had something. Himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Elena Martin stepped into the warm glow of her building's lobby, the heat wrapping around her like a long-forgotten embrace. The glass doors closed behind her, shutting out the snow, the wind, and the man who had just given her the only coat he owned. She barely nodded to the doorman. Her thoughts tangled as she crossed the marble floor toward the elevator. The jacket hung awkwardly around her shoulders, too big, worn thin at the sleeves, with a button missing, but it was warmer than anything she'd worn in years. Not just in temperature, in spirit. As the elevator rose to the top floor, Elena pressed a trembling hand against the jacket. Her fingers brushed against something tucked into the inside pocket. She paused, curious. She reached in and pulled out a folded piece of paper, rough and slightly torn at the edges. Carefully, she opened it. A child's drawing. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, stood under a crooked yellow sun. Above them, Dad and me. Between them, a tiny red heart. At the bottom, in jagged crayon letters, were the words, "I love you, Daddy, Ben." Her heart stopped. She stood frozen in the elevator, the floor numbers climbing behind her. The paper trembled in her hand. She could picture him again, Wes. The folder he held so tightly. The way he looked at the snow. Not with fear, but with the deep weariness of someone who had already weathered too many storms. The elevator chimed. Elena stepped out into her penthouse apartment. But it felt hollow. The space was immaculate, vaulted ceilings, polished wood floors, pristine white walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, a million lights glowing beneath the winter sky. But there were no photos, no clutter, no soul. She dropped her purse on the console table, then slowly peeled off the coat, holding it in one hand and the drawing in the other. She sank onto the edge of the velvet sofa, the silence of the apartment pressing in around her. The drawing lay across her knees. She stared at it, and then, without warning, her eyes filled with tears. She hadn't cried in years. Not like this. She remembered being 12, alone, cold, sitting on the stone steps of a church in the middle of winter with nothing but a trash bag of belongings and a stomach aching from hunger. That night, a man had walked by, old, rough hands, kind eyes. He didn't say much. He just took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. That one act of kindness had stayed with her forever. She never saw him again. But she had never forgotten how it felt to be seen. And now, decades later, another man, a stranger, had done the same. Elena pressed the coat against her chest, breathing in the faint scent of soap and something else. Maybe coffee, maybe memory. And she cried, not from sadness, but from something that had long been locked away inside her finally cracking open. The next morning, Elena sat at her desk, a cold cup of coffee untouched beside her. Outside, The skyline stretched endlessly, glass towers piercing the sky, but her eyes were fixed on the drawing from the coat pocket. She'd read it again and again, as though trying to commit every scribbled line to memory. At precisely 9 a.m., she reached into the drawer and rang a small silver bell. Her assistant, Mia, appeared a moment later, tablet in hand. "Yes, Ms. Martin? I need to find someone," Elena said, her voice calm but unwavering. Mia blinked. "Of course. Who?" "His name is Wes. No last name. I met him at the bus stop last night, around 56th and Madison. He gave me his coat." Mia hesitated, eyes flicking to the oversized jacket folded on the desk. "You want us to track him down?" "I want to help him." Quietly, Elena added, discreetly. Mia nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do." "And Mia," Elena added, "this stays between us. Over the next few days, Elena's team, experts in everything from corporate strategy to asset acquisition, shifted their focus to a single man with no address. They pulled security camera footage from intersections near the bus stop. Wes's figure showed up briefly in one frame, blurry, shoulders hunched, folder clutched close. They followed bus routes, pulled up boarding times, cross-referenced possible riders with existing databases. Nothing came up. Eventually, one thread emerged. A single forum post asking about day labor jobs in the Bronx. A name appeared, Wes Carter, attached to a prepaid cell number with no contract. No credit history, no digital footprint in the last 5 years. Finally, Mia returned to Elena's office with a thin folder. "We found him," she said, placing it gently on the desk. Elena flipped through the pages. An expired construction license, an old driver's license photo, a scanned resume from a decade ago. No criminal records, just silence, just absence. "Where is he now?" Elena asked. "He's been spotted living out of a truck behind an old warehouse near the South Bronx. Same area every night." Elena closed the folder. "I want to go there." Mia raised an eyebrow. "You mean, in person?" "Yes. We could send someone. Have him brought in." "No," Elena said, already standing. "This isn't a transaction. It's personal." An hour later, a black sedan pulled up to the edge of a crumbling parking lot near a row of rusted warehouses. Snow still covered the edges of the pavement, now slushed into brown ridges. Elena stepped out into the cold, the wind nipping at her coat collar. Ahead of her sat a battered green Dodge Ram, half buried under snow. She walked slowly toward it, each footstep crunching on gravel and ice. Through the windshield, she could just make out the shape of someone inside. As she approached, the truck door creaked open. Wes stepped out, blinking in the weak morning sun. He looked at her, disoriented at first, then with recognition. His face shifted, confusion, then caution, then something like shame. "Elena?" he asked, voice rough with sleep and disbelief. She offered a soft smile. "Hi, Wes." He looked down at his clothes, creased, dusty, then back at the rusted truck. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you." "Why?" His tone wasn't harsh, just deeply uncertain. Elena paused. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did. About the kind of person who gives the only coat they own to a stranger in the snow." Wes gave a short, tired laugh. "You didn't have to track me down for that. A thank you card would have done fine." "It's not about thanks," she said. "It's about not letting kindness go unseen." They stood there, two strangers from vastly different worlds. The city grinding quietly behind them. Snowflakes beginning to fall again. "You came all the way out here just to tell me that?" Wes asked. Elena met his eyes. "Yes, and maybe something more." The next time Elena saw Wes, he was hunched over a pallet of bricks at a construction site in Queens. Bundled in a flannel shirt and a neon safety vest, sleeves rolled up despite the biting cold. He worked steadily, silently, hauling, lifting, stacking, with the efficiency of a man who had done this kind of work 1,000 times, and the weariness of someone who was simply trying to get through another day. She sat in her car watching from a distance, debating whether to approach, but when Wes finally took a break and sat down on a low concrete ledge, sipping from a plastic water bottle, she stepped out and walked toward him. He looked up and blinked in surprise. For a second, he didn't move, then he stood quickly, brushing his hands on his pants. "Elena," he said, baffled. You again? She smiled, offering him a takeaway coffee cup. Thought you might like something warm. He took it carefully, as though it might disappear if he gripped it too tightly. You didn't have to do this. I know, she said, but I wanted to. They stood in silence for a few seconds, sipping coffee in the cold. Finally, she added, would you come with me for a bit? There's something I'd like to show you. He glanced back toward the job site, then toward the foreman. I still have a few hours on shift. I already spoke to him. Elena said, told him you had an interview. His brows furrowed. I don't have an interview. You do now. He let out a breath. Half a laugh. Okay, let's see what this is about. The ride was mostly quiet. Wes fidgeted in his seat, clearly conscious of the dust on his pants, the calluses on his hands, the faint scent of sweat clinging to his shirt collar. Elena didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. When they pulled up to a sleek glass building in Midtown, Wes hesitated. This where we're going? He asked, his voice dipping into uncertainty. Elena nodded. Welcome to the Infinity Building. He followed her through the polished chrome doors and into a soaring lobby with ceilings that stretched toward the sky. Professionals bustled past them, pressed suits, briefcases, confident strides. Wes moved slower, stiff, unsure, feeling like he didn't belong. Inside a private conference room on the 27th floor, Elena gestured for him to sit. Wes dropped into the chair like he wasn't sure it would hold him. So, he said, voice guarded, what is this? You returning the coat? Elena shook her head gently. No, I kept that. It's mine now. Wes blinked. Okay, I didn't bring you here to thank you. She said, I brought you here because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. A version of myself I lost somewhere along the way. You gave me that moment back. He looked away. I'm just a guy trying to get by. And that's exactly why I want you here. She slid a folder across the table. Wes opened it. Inside was a printed job offer, complete with a contract, salary, benefits, title, Human Values Advisor. His brow furrowed. What is this? It's a new role, Elena explained. One I created. Someone who sits in on department meetings, strategy sessions, hiring discussions, not to talk about profits or metrics, but people, humanity, perspective. You'd help us build a company with more heart. Wes shook his head. You've got the wrong guy. I don't have a degree. I haven't been in an office in years. I live in a truck. You were an engineer, she reminded him. I haven't built anything in a decade. You built something that night, she said softly. You built a moment that changed me. He ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed. This isn't charity, Elena continued. This is a job, one only you can do. Because you've lived it, you've felt invisible, ignored, pushed aside, and yet, when no one was looking, you chose kindness. That's real leadership. Wes looked down at the folder again, eyes stinging. I'm not qualified, he whispered. You don't need a diploma to teach people how to care. Elena said gently, you just have to show up, like you did that night. Their eyes met, and something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Later that day, Wes sat on a bench outside the Infinity Building, the folder unopened on his lap. His hands rested on it, but his eyes stared straight ahead, unfocused. It didn't feel real. It felt like a trap disguised as an opportunity. Something beautiful dangling just out of reach, waiting to be snatched away. He didn't see Elena approach until she was already sitting beside him. You didn't read it, she said softly. I didn't need to, Wes muttered. I already know how it ends. How's that? Someone like me doesn't belong here, he said. You don't build an empire by hiring men who sleep in trucks. She didn't respond right away. Then she said, come with me, just for an hour. No offices, no pressure, just trust me. He looked at her for a long second. Then he nodded. They drove 40 minutes out of the city, away from the skyscrapers and into a quieter part of town, brick buildings, weathered storefronts, small parks blanketed in snow. Finally, they pulled up outside a modest red brick building with a peeling green awning. The sign above the door read, Thomas's Place, a safe space for every child. Wes followed her inside. The walls were painted with murals, trees, animals, handprints in every color. The air smelled faintly of crayons and warm bread. Somewhere down the hall, children's laughter rang out, unfiltered, pure. Elena led him past a small kitchen, a reading nook, into a large open playroom where kids were building puzzles and stacking blocks. Volunteers helped tie shoes, read books, clean up spilled juice. This place, Elena said, her voice quiet, is named after the man who saved me. Wes looked at her. I grew up in the system. She continued, bounced between homes. Some were okay, some weren't. When I was 12, I ran away. It was freezing. I curled up outside a church, hoping to make it through the night. That's when Thomas found me. She swallowed. He didn't ask questions. He just sat beside me and gave me his coat. He stayed until morning. I never saw him again, but I never forgot how it felt to be seen. Wes didn't speak. Last week, someone else gave me a coat. She said, didn't know me, didn't ask anything in return. Just gave. She looked at him. You remind me of him. They stood in silence for a long time, surrounded by the soft sound of children at play. Elena placed a hand on his arm. I don't need you to impress anyone in a boardroom. I need you to remind people of this, of what it means to care. Wes didn't answer, but his eyes welled with quiet, unexpected tears. Then he nodded. Not for the job, not for her, but for himself. Because for the first time in years, he remembered what it felt like to matter. Wes's first official day at Infinity Group passed without ceremony. There were no welcome banners or emails, no cameras or fanfare, just a quiet introduction in a modest conference room on the 5th floor, where a half circle of team leaders sat flipping through notes, exchanging skeptical glances. Elena introduced him simply. This is Wes Hartman. He's joining us as a human values advisor. There were polite nods, forced smiles, but the unease in the room was unmistakable. Wes didn't try to dazzle them. He didn't walk in with a PowerPoint, or launch into some grand vision. He just talked, slowly, honestly, no performance, no act. He told them what it felt like to lose a job, a home, a family, what it meant to wake up each morning in the cab of a truck and still get dressed like you believed in tomorrow. He told them how he used to be an engineer, and how sometimes he still dreamed of blueprints. But mostly, he talked about people, their worth, their stories, their pain. At first, they listened with the stiff politeness reserved for corporate introductions. But slowly, something changed. As the days went on, people started staying after meetings just to chat. Then the interns began stopping by his desk. Then department heads. Some came to talk about stress, others to ask advice on handling conflict. Some just wanted someone to sit with over lunch. Wes had a way of listening that made people feel like they mattered. He never interrupted. He didn't rush. And when he did speak, he said things that stuck. Don't mistake exhaustion for failure. You're not falling apart. You're just tired from caring too much for too long without anyone noticing. That quote ended up printed on mugs, hung on office walls, whispered between colleagues like a mantra. Elena watched it unfold from her office, the shift in atmosphere, the return of warmth to the break room, the sudden spark in conversations. People weren't just working, they were connecting again. A few months in, Wes had a small office of his own, nothing fancy. A little corner space with a second-hand couch, a couple of potted plants, and a coffee machine that never quite stopped brewing. His desk was usually buried under hand-scribbled notes, dog-eared books, and drawings from employees' kids. But people came. They came because it felt safe. They came because Wes never made them feel small. Outside of work, his life had begun to rebuild in quiet, meaningful pieces. With a modest housing stipend and help from Elena, he moved into a small one-bedroom house on the edge of Brooklyn. It wasn't much, but it had walls that didn't leak, a heater that worked, and a porch with enough space for 2 chairs and a little flower box. For the first time in a long time, Wes had keys that opened a front door. More importantly, he had space for Noah. By then, his son was a freshman at a local university. They had started reconnecting slowly, phone calls, emails, short visits. But the night Wes invited him over for dinner, Noah showed up with a grocery bag and a smile that still held the same crooked grin from the crayon drawing. They made spaghetti together, garlic bread, too. It was simple, but the kind of night Wes would carry in his chest forever. You kept your promise, Noah had said as they sat at the tiny kitchen table. Wes didn't respond. He couldn't. but his eyes did the talking. Meanwhile, his connection with Elena had shifted too, subtly, quietly, without pressure. It began with shared meetings, then occasional lunches, then long subway rides after work. Before either of them realized it, those walks turned into coffees on weekends, and those coffees turned into evenings sitting on the steps of Wes's new porch, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rushed, it was real. They were two people who had armored themselves for years, only to discover a kind of softness in each other that made it okay to let some of that guard down. One evening, as the city skyline blazed orange behind them, Elena turned to Wes. "You've changed this company," she said. He chuckled softly. "Nah, I just reminded them of something they already knew." She looked at him, eyes shimmering. "And you reminded me, too." Wes had just wrapped up a team workshop on workplace resilience when a young employee lingered behind. He looked barely 22, skinny, nervous, eyes red-rimmed with sleeplessness. "Hey," the kid said, voice shaking. I needed to tell you something." Wes set his notes down. The young man swallowed. "A month ago, I was gonna quit everything, not just this job, life. I was done." He paused. "But then I sat in one of your sessions. You said something about how people don't need to be fixed, they just need to be heard." Wes's heart thudded in his chest. No one had ever said that to me before. The kid went on. "It felt like someone finally saw me. And that was enough to make me stay. I'm still here because of you." For a long moment, Wes couldn't speak. Then he placed a hand on the kid's shoulder. "I'm really glad you're still here." That night, Wes sat in his little office long after everyone else had gone. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the city through the windows. On the corner of his desk sat a sticky note with a scribbled quote. "You don't need to be perfect to matter. You just need to show up." He leaned back, eyes closed, hands clasped over his chest. He had once wondered if he'd ever matter again. Now he knew. He had built more than buildings. He had built people, and that made all the difference. The grand atrium of Infinity Group had never looked like this. Gone were the towering LED screens showcasing stock metrics or product launches. In their place hung soft white fabric drapes cascading from the rafters. Strings of warm fairy lights twinkled overhead, and scattered between planters and open cafe tables were handwritten signs that simply read, "Kindness is contagious." Employees stood shoulder to shoulder in their best clothes, not for business, but for something far more meaningful. On the main stage, standing beneath a halo of gentle light, Elena Langston approached the podium. Her voice, so often sharp in meetings and precise in pitch decks, now carried something different, something softer. "This day isn't about growth," she said, eyes sweeping over the crowd. "It's not about targets or algorithms. Today is about moments." The room hushed. Even the usual hum of the city beyond the glass walls felt distant. "A year ago, I stood at a bus stop, cold, frustrated, and honestly, lost. I didn't realize it at the time. But something inside me had been slowly breaking. Not because of failure, but because I had forgotten how to see people. And then," she paused, her gaze finding one familiar face in the crowd. "A man gave me his coat. No questions, no introductions. He didn't know who I was. And he didn't care. He just saw someone who was cold. And he gave the only thing he had to give." Gasps and soft murmurs stirred through the audience. Elena turned to a stand beside her and pulled away a black silk cloth. Underneath was a large glass frame. Inside it, the very same coat, frayed at the sleeves, faded by time, but preserved like an artifact of something holy. Below it, etched in bronze, "One small act of kindness can rewrite a life." Her voice wavered. "That coat didn't just warm me that night, it cracked something open in me. It reminded me what it feels like to be human again." She turned toward the crowd. "And today, we honor not just that act, but the man who reminded us all what truly matters." Her eyes found him again. "Wes Hartman, will you come up here?" There was a brief pause. Then a wave of applause. Wes stood slowly, dressed in a borrowed suit that still somehow carried his quiet strength. As he walked toward the stage, many in the crowd reached out to pat his shoulder, shake his hand. His face, weathered but at peace, carried the gravity of someone who had walked through fire and come out not bitter, but better. Elena met him at the top of the steps. She didn't offer a handshake. She held out a white envelope. "This," she said, "belongs to you." Wes opened it carefully. Inside was the deed to his home, stamped, signed, and officially transferred. He looked up, stunned. "No more sleeping in trucks," Elena said with a soft smile. The applause grew, swelling like a wave. Wes stepped toward the mic. But instead of speaking, he lifted a hand. I have something too," he said, voice thick. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn box. "I kept this," he said, turning to Elena, "in the pocket of that same coat. Not because I thought I'd ever use it again, but because it reminded me of what I still hoped for." He opened it. Inside, a silver ring, simple. No diamonds, no engraving. Just a quiet, glinting promise. Wes's voice shook as he continued. "You said that coat changed your life. But you changed mine. You gave me back my name. My son. A place to belong. Hope." He stepped forward. "Elena Langston, will you marry me?" A hush fell. And then, Elena laughed. Not a boardroom chuckle. A real, full laugh that cracked through the tension like sunshine after snow. "Yes," she whispered, through tears. "Of course, yes." The room erupted. Applause thundered through the glass dome. People stood, cheered, wiped their eyes. Somewhere near the back, Noah clapped so hard his hands stung. A month later, their wedding was held not in a 5-star hotel or a beach resort, but at Thomas's place, the red brick community center built in memory of the man who had once offered young Elena his coat. The decorations were handmade, paper flowers, folded cranes, banners drawn by children. The chairs didn't match. The cake was baked by an intern. But the warmth, that was real. Wes stood at the front in his pressed suit, the same one from the ceremony at Infinity. Beside him stood Noah, taller now, with a spark in his eyes and the same proud grin as his father. The guests were a mix of shelter volunteers, startup founders, janitors, interns, HR managers, and half a dozen kids who had once drawn pictures for Wes's office wall. And when Elena walked down the aisle, she didn't wear a designer gown. She wore a simple white dress, her hair down, her heart wide open. They met in the middle of the room, under a skylight that cast a warm beam on the ceremony. Elena took Wes's hands. "Once," she said, "you gave me a coat." She smiled through tears. "Today, I give you my whole life." The vows echoed like music through the community center. Wes could barely respond. His voice cracked. His eyes blurred, but he managed to whisper, "I'll never stop choosing you." Afterward, the celebration spilled into the courtyard. Kids ran barefoot through bubbles. Old friends danced under strings of lights. The easel with the coat stood quietly in one corner, its presence needing no explanation anymore. Someone snapped a photo. Wes and Elena, standing beneath the old painted sign of Thomas's place, arms around each other. Behind them, the coat. In front of them, a future built not on fortune or fame, but on kindness. That photo went viral. A symbol, a reminder that you don't need riches to be remembered. Just a heart that sees others. Just a willingness to give. The photo of Wes and Elena, taken in the golden wash of sunset under the words Thomas's Place, circulated across social media platforms like wildfire. It didn't come with a hashtag or a viral campaign. It came with a feeling. People shared it not for spectacle but for something else, something quieter. A longing to believe in good. A craving for stories that didn't begin with scandal and end in cynicism. The image sparked news features, think pieces, and even a short documentary titled, "The Man with the Coat." But through all of it, Wes remained Wes. He still arrived at Infinity Group before 8 a.m., still brewed the coffee in his corner space, still made time to talk to the janitor and interns alike. But everything else had changed. His new house in Brooklyn had walls filled with photos, real ones. Wes, Noah, and Elena smiling on a picnic blanket. Wes helping a child tie their shoes at the community center. Elena sitting cross-legged on the porch reading aloud while Wes grilled dinner. Noah came home every weekend from university, and their conversations, once reduced to phone calls and supervised visits, had bloomed again. Now, they sat up late together laughing about old memories, watching sci-fi reruns, or just enjoying the silence only family understands. Wes's days were now split between his role at Infinity Group and helping expand the reach of Thomas's Place. He was the face of its new initiative, Warm Starts, a program that gave jackets, warm meals, and mentorship to kids and adults in need of second chances. Each coat came with a note that read, "This isn't charity, this is a beginning. You matter." He spoke at schools, shelters, and business panels, not as an executive, but as someone who knew what it felt like to sleep in a truck and still believe in dignity. And the most beautiful part? He never forgot, not where he came from, not who he used to be. He didn't erase the memory of cold nights or silent prayers. He carried it, not as baggage, but as a compass, even after months had passed. On quiet mornings before the sun rose, Wes would still step outside onto his small Brooklyn porch with a mug of black coffee and watch the city slowly wake. Some days, Elena joined him. On one such morning, bundled in a flannel robe, she leaned against the railing beside him, steam rising from her own mug. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "how different things would be if you hadn't offered me that coat?" Wes looked at her. "No," he said simply, "because I would have offered it either way." She smiled. "You didn't even hesitate. You looked cold," he replied, with a shrug. "Didn't feel like a decision. Just felt right." She reached for his hand, fingers intertwining. "You changed my life that night," she said softly. Wes squeezed her hand. "You reminded me I still had one." Behind them, the front door creaked open. Noah stepped out with messy hair, holding a pan of burnt toast. "Okay, I tried to cook," he said sheepishly, "but I might have just set off the smoke alarm." Wes and Elena both laughed, deep, full, grateful laughter. Moments like these, simple and unscripted, were the true miracles. Not the accolades, not the headlines, but the ordinary, extraordinary quiet of second chances lived well. Later that spring, a new mural was painted outside the original Thomas's Place building. Bright and sprawling, it stretched across the brick wall, showing a man handing a child a coat beneath a sky full of stars. In the corner, painted in gold script, were the words, "One small act of kindness can rewrite the ending." And that's exactly what Wes did. He didn't build apps, he didn't lead IPOs, but he built something more permanent than code. He rebuilt lives, with nothing more than presence, patience, and a coat. And maybe that's the kind of legacy we all hope for in the end, not to be remembered for wealth or influence, but to be remembered by someone who can say, "Because of you, I'm still here." If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe to Tellinight. At Tellinight, stories remind us that healing begins with hope, and even the gentlest kindness can rewrite a destiny. Don't forget to tap the bell so you never miss a story that could brighten your day or transform your perspective. Until our next story, keep your heart open and your spirit brave.